Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We are continuing our discussion of the arrival of Europeans in the New World. In the previous lecture, we concluded with some introductory thoughts about one of the most pivotal years in the history of the world, the year 1521. And I mentioned the fact that in that year, the explorer Ferdinand Magellan first successfully circumnavigated the globe, sailed around the world, and demonstrated to all what exactly confronted the Spanish and others in the Americas. This discovery, which we'll talk more about in just a few minutes, really indicated to Europeans we're going to have to make the most out of what we find in North America because we're not going to be able to easily sail around it. The other pivotal event of that year 1521 was the conquest of the Aztecs by the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez. Obviously, this is a pivotal event, so I'm going to talk about this for just a few moments. Now, this conquest is actually going to further that idea that the Spanish need to make the most out of what they find in the Americas. And in fact, there are resources and wealth and riches to be had in the Americas. And Cortez and his conquest demonstrated that. Now, as I described in an earlier lecture, the Aztecs were a well-developed society in what is today central Mexico. The chief city of the Aztec Empire was Tenochtitlan, the site of modern-day Mexico City, a city at that time of roughly 200,000 people, one of the largest cities in the world, and 3 times larger than the largest Spanish city, Seville. In the Aztecs, Cortez found the wealth that the Spanish had been looking for, rooms filled with gold. Now, the conquest of the Aztecs was startling in its rapidity, because, in fact, the Spanish conquistadors numbered only a few hundred, while, as mentioned, the Aztecs numbered tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands. But the Spanish had certain advantages that allowed them to overwhelm the Aztecs. The Spanish brought guns, lances, swords, and other weapons, which shocked and overwhelmed the Aztecs. And they came riding horses, as you see in this picture, which overwhelmed the Aztecs. More significant still was disease and smallpox, which weakened the ranks of the Aztecs and in some ways wiped them out even before Cortez and his soldiers began the process of military conquest. Cortez and his men also took advantage of an element of uncertainty among the Aztecs, who were divided in what they thought about these new arrivals and were uncertain what the Spanish intended. And so by the time Cortez kind of flipped the tables and began launching his attack, the divisions among the Aztecs, it was too late for them to recover. Following Cortez and this conquest, the population of Mexico and Peru declined by some 90% or more, from about 35 million to only 2 million in the 50 years or so after Columbus. And again, this conquest reinforced the thought that there was wealth to be had in the Americas, and combined with Magellan's voyage, proved that in fact the Americas themselves could become a destination, a permanent objective in their own right, rather than a place to be skipped over and avoided on the way to Asia. Cortez's conquest also launched a flurry of other activity, and dozens more conquistadors followed in his footsteps, attempting similar kinds of conquests. Some of them were successful, including Francisco Pizarro, who in 1535 conquered the Incas in Peru, another great society also laden with riches and gold. Other such voyages were not so successful, and in some cases led to some of the conquistadors and explorers wandering in the wilderness for years in vain in the quest for gold that was never found. So as you look at this map, this gives you an indication of some of those early voyages and conquests. The orange arrows indicating the explorations of Columbus, who I mentioned in the previous lecture, never penetrated very far into the Americas. And then here is Cortez and his conquest of Tenochtitlan, and here is Pizarro on his way down to Peru. So we need to talk about the impact of these first Spanish explorations and settlements in the Americas. And as I mentioned previously, the Spanish begin to utilize Indian labor to accomplish the many tasks that they begin to need as they start to extract resources, as I mentioned, from the Americas themselves. So whether you're talking about mining for gold or silver, or ultimately the realization among the Spanish that sugar flourishes in these tropical climates, and sugar was becoming a very desirable commodity in Europe, and the Spanish begin growing sugar wherever they can. Well, all of those involve massive needs in terms of labor. Are the conquistadors going to do this themselves, or the Spanish settlers? Of course not. They need another source of labor, and so they initially rely on Indian labor. There were several different arrangements under which this was done, none of them, of course, pleasant, all of them resulting in great hardship and many cases death for Indians, and they just don't work out as a long-term source of labor. As I've mentioned, Indians begin dying off from disease. Many of them begin running away. In some cases, they're just perceived to not be good workers. They don't work as hard as perhaps they should, and their numbers just begin declining. And so ultimately, the Spanish begin turning to another source of labor, African slaves. And again, this begins very early on in the process. The first African slaves purchased by Europeans in 1502. The first shipments to Cuba arrived in 1512, and the first shipments to Brazil in 1538. Eventually, more than 3 million Africans were sold into slavery in Spanish America and 5 million into Brazil. So let's just summarize the impact of these early Spanish conquests, explorations, and settlement. They lead to a number of important precedents which we're going to be exploring in other settlement moving forward, including and most especially English settlements. They introduce the idea of intermixing of the races. I mentioned this to you in the previous lecture, the creation of the mestizo race, the mix of Spanish and Native American. There also involves the mixing of African into this, and you create a wide array of different races in the Americas right from the beginning. I also mentioned to you the enslavement of the Indians, which is something that we're going to see with other groups as well. The hugely important introduction of disease, which wipes out Native American populations in the Caribbean and begins to spread through other parts of the Americas. Ultimately, of course, the Spanish turned to African slavery, and we're going to be talking about this process in great detail over many, many lectures throughout this course. And finally, I mentioned briefly the introduction of missionaries in the Americas, the various efforts to convert Indians to quote-unquote correct versions of religion and behavior. Now, all of these themes we're going to be looking at with other European groups as well, beginning with the French and the Dutch, which we're going to be talking about in the next lecture.